And a warm welcome to all of you from Notre Dame and from the team at the London Global Gateway. The Gateway is coordinating this effort. It's our inaugural London Book Club. I'm Father Jim Leese, a priest of the Congregation of Holy Cross and the academic lead for the Notre Dame London program. I want to thank you for participating today. Over the next 4 weeks, we will read 2 novels that inspired film director Alfred Hitchcock. The first, Marie Belloc Lowndes' The Lodger, published in 1913, which many of you would have begun reading already if you've not completed it. And it was adapted to a film by the same title in 1927. And then Joseph Conrad's novel, The Secret Agent, published in 1907, which became Hitchcock's film Sabotage, released in 1936. It is our hope that over the course of the next few weeks, we will build a virtual community and connect with people globally to reflect upon the material presented, the genius of Alfred Hitchcock, and the marvels of the City of London. We're thrilled with the number of people who've registered for this event, over 490 by last count. It's very exciting for us. We recognize that the commitment of time in a virtual setting may have become quite tedious in recent months, which is why we've formatted this book club with as much interaction and engagement as possible through discussion boards and breakout sessions. You'll see how that goes during the course of our time together. We hope you'll find your experience with the London Book Club insightful and engaging, and we hope you stay connected not only to us at the London Global Gateway, but also to the global Notre Dame network that is represented by the geographic diversity of those of you who have joined us, the reach of Notre Dame's efforts through the Office of Notre Dame International, and the programming offered by ThinkND. At this time, I want to take a moment to thank our partners, the partners of the London Book Club. The London Global Gateway has been supported in this effort by the College of Arts and Letters, Notre Dame International, the DeBartolo Center for Performing Arts, the Nanovic Institute, Notre Dame Learning, and the Notre Dame Alumni Association. Thanks to all of our co-sponsors who have put in so much time and talent into bringing this program to life. And I also want to give a shout out to Joe Byrne from the London Global Gateway, who has been instrumental in bringing this program together on the London side. As we have such a large group this afternoon, we ask you to use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen to send in your questions. We'll try to answer as many as possible, though you can imagine that would be a feat. So in the likely event that we won't get to them all, we do have a private discussion board on LinkedIn where we invite you to participate in the conversation in between the live sessions with Professor Ohmer. And now it's my honor to introduce you my colleague and friend, Professor Susan Ohmer, who is also a dear friend of the London Global Gateway, having spent a couple of summers and a recent semester teaching in London for Notre Dame. Susan brings a love of the great city of London, a knowledge of the effort it takes to bring a work of literature to the big screen, and her focus on Hitchcock, who was London born and began his remarkable career in London, is only fitting. Professor Ohmer teaches classes in film and television history and culture, courses such as media and presidential elections, Alfred Hitchcock, and of course on Walt Disney. In fact, she's completing a book on the history of the Disney studio. As Susan has said, she gets to teach all the fun stuff. A more detailed biography of Susan is available on the ThinkND website. As you may know, when we promoted this event, we shared a few pre-recorded videos that are posted on the ThinkND website, where Susan provided a very fine overview of our topic. For those of you who have not had a chance to watch them, I recommend checking them out on the ThinkND website at your leisure. Susan, the warmest of welcomes to you today.
Thank you so much, Father Jim, and thank you all for joining us with all the things going on in our lives. It's just lovely to have you here with us. I'm so happy to see everybody's backgrounds, the different spaces and places that you're coming from, and some of those beautiful virtual backgrounds of London. Father Jim and I are going to share some with you each week, so those of us who aren't able to travel to London can enjoy it that way. So thank you all for being here, and I want to thank especially 2 of my students who were here, my former students, Katie and Bella, hello. It's lovely to see you in any form. So thank you so much for being with us today. What I'd like to do for the next few minutes is to just preview what we're going to talk about for the next couple of weeks, and then go into a little extra detail about our novel today. Then we are going to put everybody into breakout rooms. And from my experience of the Kylemore Book Club, I can say that this was really fun because it's in the breakout rooms that you can talk to each other and trade notes. And I've come up with some discussion questions that I think might be interesting for people to compare notes on. So when I finish these few remarks, we'll do that. And then we'll come back and have a Q&A session. And that's your chance, as Father Jim said, to ask any questions that are on your mind. So if anything occurred to you during the reading, or if there's something you'd like to reflect on or ask more about, please feel free to add that in the chat, as Father Jim said. So when I was honored to be asked to help launch the London Book Club, and I was thinking about different things that we could focus on, and some of you may think that, well, when we think of a book club, we don't necessarily think of Alfred Hitchcock, but one of the things that makes Hitchcock such a good choice for us is that there are some fascinating contrasts between the books that he and his screenwriters adapted for the screen and the films themselves. It's especially true of The Lodger, and it's also true of Sabotage. So you get into some really interesting issues of adaptation when you talk about the novels and the films. And I chose the two that I did because The Lodger was the first film he directed in London. It's one of the most famous. And Sabotage, I confess, is one of my personal favorite Hitchcock films about London. It is in the city. The characters move through the city. They take the double-decker buses. They do a lot of walking. You see different parts of the city. So with Sabotage and also with The Lodger, you feel as if you're back in London. And I'll take any chance I can get to be back in London. So that's why I thought about those films. But Hitchcock, as we know, is a quintessential English director, even though he spent the last half of his career in Hollywood. For the first 40 years of his life, he lived in London. And that's where he became a professional. It's where he learned to direct films. It's where he directed 24 films before he went to Hollywood, and where he learned about film through the city's film culture, which is something I talked about in one of the videos for this week. London had a vibrant film culture, and Hitchcock was able to take advantage of it when he lived there, and to learn about different approaches to film that were being developed by European filmmakers and film theorists and other directors and writers that he was working with. In fact, as you know from this week's videos, he spent a year in Germany and directed 2 films there, and was able to experience the vibrant German film culture and art culture of the mid-1920s. So for those of us who are friends of the Nanovic, and I know some of you are with us today, next week we will talk about Hitchcock's experience in Germany. So some of the videos will connect with your interest there, I think. So he was very much a part of London up until he left for Hollywood in 1939. But the interesting thing for me too is that even after he was in Hollywood, he would reflect back on his experience of London. And you see this in some of his American films. So Rebecca, for example, which was his first Hollywood film with David Selznick, who was the producer for Gone with the Wind. Rebecca was adapted from Daphne du Maurier's novel. It takes place in an English country home. It's a very English film, even though he directed it while he was working in a London studio. And then a few years later, he made Foreign Correspondent, which is part of it takes place during the Blitz in London. So it's saturated with that feeling of the city. He went on to direct Stage Fright, which is set in a London theater. And The Parodying Case, which is very interesting. The Parodying Case was a film that he made in Hollywood in the late 1940s. And much of it, it's a courtroom drama, and much of it takes place in the Old Bailey. And he reconstructed the courtrooms of the Old Bailey exactly in Hollywood, completely down to the furniture. And in fact, he flew the Chief Justice of the Old Bailey over to Hollywood to be sure he was getting it right. So Hitchcock was clearly a director who who loved London, for whom London was in his blood. It was part of his memory, his childhood, his life. There's stories that when he was growing up, one of his favorite things to do was just roam around the city. And his parents were always worried that he might get lost or might get hurt or something might happen to him when he was walking through the streets. But he loved London. And so even after he went to Hollywood, his films are steeped in London. So this week we're going to talk about Mrs. Belloc Lowndes' novel, which some of you are saying in our link book page, if you'd like to contribute to that. Some of you have said it's very atmospheric. It is a wonderful psychological novel. It's very much about the character's mentality. Even though it was loosely inspired by the story of Jack the Ripper, it's not steeped in crime and gore at all. It's much more about the character's perceptions as they begin to wonder if their lodger is in fact the avenger, the criminal in the novel. And interestingly, I mentioned in the videos that the novel was a very popular book. It was also very respected. And in fact, Gertrude Stein, who many of us think of as an avant-garde writer, admired it very much and actually recommended it to Ernest Hemingway, who liked it. He said it was delightful and he really enjoyed reading it. So it's kind of interesting to think that the novel that we're reading for this week was one that Ernest Hemingway also enjoyed. It's not a connection one might automatically think of, but he liked it too. So we know we're in good company there. So that's our focus for this week. And in the video where I suggested things to look at, I particularly mentioned the character of Mrs. Bunting and the character of Daisy in The Detective. And I highlighted those because they contrast sharply with what we'll see in the film. I'll give you a tiny heads up that in the film, Daisy is a blonde, sophisticated, fashionable, modern young woman. She is not the sheltered country girl in the novel. So as you watch the film next week, it will be interesting to think about the effect of making that change. It's a very deliberate change. And the detective in the novel, who is the upright representative of the law, he is honest, he is moral. He's the kind of person you want Daisy to marry if you were her father. He's not so much that way in the film. So I think you'll find some interesting contrasts with the detective in the film. So the pairing of the novel and the film that we'll see next week are very intriguing. Then in the third week, we will read excerpts from Joseph Conrad's novel, The Secret Agent. And some of you might think, didn't Hitchcock make a film called The Secret Agent? Which he did, but it only uses the title from the Conrad. It's not actually based on the novel. He had the rights to the novel, but he decided to use the title for one film and the novel for a different one, which is a little confusing, but hey, we can live with it. So the novel, The Secret Agent, inspired the film Sabotage, which is the film that we'll be seeing in the fourth week. The Secret Agent is a challenging novel. It is about a group of terrorists in London in the 1890s, and many of the characters share their political views. And if you're interested in political philosophy, you will love it. If you're not, it's still very interesting to see how people thought and how Conrad represented their views. But the reason, truly for me, the reason to read The Secret Agent is that when you do, and then you see Hitchcock's Sabotage, it is even more stunning than if you didn't know the novel. The changes are phenomenal. Just as one small example, in the novel, the main characters, Mr. and Mrs. Verloc, run a shop that sells pornography. In the film, they run a movie theater. So already you get a sense of the possibilities that change opens up for a film about these secret agents in this terrorist group. So Sabotage is just stunning. And reading the novel, and I say this as a film historian, now an English professor would say, why the novel's better, but as a film historian, I will say that it's wonderful to read the novel because it just enriches our experience of the film. So I think you're in for a real treat this semester, and that it's just going to be wonderful to talk with everybody and hear your thoughts.
Well, welcome back all. I think most of you have returned from your breakout rooms. As Susan mentioned, we invite each of your room leads to submit any questions that you might have come up with or key takeaways that you discussed using the form that's shared in the chat to discuss these with Susan. Please go ahead and enter your comments now, and we'll begin with a couple of prepared questions as we enter into conversation with Susan about the movie. Susan, The Lodger is a fictionalized version of the Jack the Ripper story, as you have said. And was it the first novel to dramatize these events, or were there others? Was this a unique kind of approach to that particular topic at the time?
No, Father Jim, it's very interesting. I was frankly stunned to learn that there were short stories, there were fictionalized accounts of one of the lodger's murders practically a month after it happened. So writers didn't waste any time before they started representing this criminal in literature. So right off the bat, in 1888, 1889, English writers began telling fictionalized stories. And then it spread to the continent. There were stories in Germany, in France, in Switzerland, in Spain. And then, of course, it became a staple of English writing in the 20th century. It's also interesting, the Ripper comes back in film. There are recent films with Johnny Depp, for example, but in the 1920s, there were German expressionist films that refer to the Ripper. There's a wonderful expressionist film that came out the year after The Lodger. Hitchcock certainly would have seen it, but it didn't influence The Lodger. A film called Pandora's Box, which is by the German director G.W. Pabst. It stars Louise Brooks, and it's one of the greats of Germany in the 1920s. And the last character she encounters is the Jack the Ripper character. So he has populated literature, film, and opera. Lulu has a Ripper character. So it was all over the place, and it didn't take long. So clearly the actions of that criminal and the fact that he was never caught influenced people's imaginations.
Interesting. Now, this book club focuses on Hitchcock's adaptations of two novels. And I'm wondering why you chose these two. You mentioned it a little bit earlier, but why you chose these two films and their associated novels. Was there something about these two that you found particularly compelling in sharing with us?
I felt really inspired by our decision to focus on London. London as a place of culture, London as a place that has been represented in literature and film. And so thinking about Hitchcock's films, these were the two that I felt were most deeply steeped in the city of London. Another one might be Blackmail, because one of the characters live in London and take long walks through London. That was complicated because there's both a silent and a sound version. But The Lodger and especially Sabotage are just, London is integral to them. The spaces, the buildings. There's a sequence in Sabotage of about 20 minutes where one of the characters walks through London, then takes a bus through London. He goes from the East End to Piccadilly, and much of the film goes with him. So if we're thinking about London as a place that we want to remember and that we want to celebrate, those are the films that really come to mind, I think.
I am in exile on campus because of the pandemic, but having watched that movie recently, I was struck by how much longing I had for being back there. It was lovely to see the streets of London, even in that earlier era, maybe especially so. You mentioned in your introductory remarks and in the videos that Hitchcock not only read Mrs. Belloc Lowndes' novel, but that he and his family saw the play adapted from it in 1960. Can you tell us more, or 16, can you tell us more about that production and how it might have impacted him at the time?
I'm glad you asked that because there's something surprising there. So Mrs. Belloc Lowndes approved of the play. It was adapted by a man named Horace Vatchell, and I don't think a script exists. But I've gone back in the course of my research and looked at reviews of it. And the most interesting thing about this play is that it was a comedy. It wasn't a crime thriller. It was semi-suspenseful, but it was mainly a comedy. So it's really intriguing to think about The Lodger as a comedy, and that was one experience Hitchcock had of the story. So in the play, it takes place in a boarding house in Bloomsbury, so a different part of town from the one where the Buntings live. And they have a lodger who is an aristocrat who's in disguise because he's been jilted by his love, and he wants to find a woman who will love him for himself and not just because he's a wealthy aristocrat. And he's considered to be very eccentric. And one of the reasons he's considered to be so odd in the play is that he makes his own salad dressings. This is singled out in the reviews as how strange can you get that you make your own salad dressings. So that's kind of funny. And so he falls for, not Daisy, the Buntings don't have a daughter in the play. He falls for another lodger who is a writer. So she's progressive in that sense. And there is a detective character, but the detective is the Bunting's son. So there's a switch there. So anyway, it's fascinating to think of this as a comedy, and that even a few years after the novel, people were able to reinvent that story. So I wish there were a published version of the play, but the reviews are all we have. And I will add, it was performed in both London and Broadway, and you will love this, Father Jim, and many of our participants who are veteran theater goers. It was performed at the Haymarket Theater, which is right in front of our London headquarters. So that just made it feel all the more special to me to know that Mrs. Belloc's play of The Lodger premiered there.
Indeed. I'm going to turn to our participants' questions now. One is a rhetorical question, I'm sure. It simply says, Susan, might you commit murder? And it said one in our breakout room wondered if being locked up with family during the pandemic might be enough to justify. We won't touch that as an answer for you. What is the definition of murder? There was an attorney in one of the discussion groups and added that interesting dimension to their discussion. It was interesting how the question juxtaposed potential criminal activity in this context. Is it meant to align with the character's departure from a moral center? It's basically getting at, how do you see murder being used in the context of this work of fiction?
Now that is an interesting question, and one reason I wanted to pose it is that I suspected that our very keen and perceptive participants would enjoy thinking about the complexities of it, because when we think of murder and the way it's presented in the novel, it's gratuitous. Murder, we often think of, is killing someone without reason, without provocation, in a purely immoral and illegal way. But if one thinks of murder more generally as, say, taking someone else's life, then there might be circumstances where it's even legal, say in self-defense, or if a police officer has to do that in the line of duty, or in the case of the military, if we're in a war, someone is under attack, one might justifiably and legally and even morally take the life of another person. So I wonder, in looking at that interview with Mrs. Belloc Lowndes, if she meant that, or if she was thinking in terms of criminals, or would any of us in the throes of a provocation take someone's life? Certainly one of the questions that's come up in our experiences of lockdowns is the way that this is affecting people's relationships and sense of each other. There are many stories of people realizing that they are not meant to be because of the experience of being locked up for so many months. And then there are stories of people who realize that they're grateful to have the partners that they do. And since my husband is one of our participants, I am happy to take this opportunity to say that being locked down with him has been a great joy. Really, I would do it all over again. There's nobody I would rather be locked down with. So he has no fear of anything happening to him. I would do my best to cherish him. But I think that Mrs. Lowndes in that interview was meant to be provocative and meant to say that people are capable of many things. And I think she's right. I think very often people could be driven to something, but there are also legal and moral and ethical frameworks where many of us might think that taking life is a moral or appropriate decision. So I bet there were some good discussions on that one.
Don't doubt it. There's another interesting question that refers to the point you make about the author's mention of opportunity makes the criminal. And it speaks to less to the Avenger than perhaps the Buntings and how they mull over their complicity in this as we go through the novel and sort of their level of ownership and how that ought to be construed. How do you see the opportunity makes the criminal playing out in the Buntings case, because in essence, they've entered into this rather complicated complicity.
Well, I think one of the reasons the novel is so engaging for many of us is that it does focus on the Buntings, particularly Mrs. Bunting's thought processes. And so we see her trying to reason through a situation. We might even say rationalize a situation. Why doesn't she want to believe that Mr. Sleuth might be guilty of these terrible crimes? She feels almost maternal towards him. She defends him. She just doesn't want to think that such things are possible. And in the film, this is brought out visually as well as through words. We see it in the use of lighting and the set design and so on. So I think one of the reasons that the novel's so engaging, and really why I thought it would be so engaging for our participants, is that it is so much about thinking through a situation. And one of the things that you and I and many of our participants know about in education at Notre Dame is that we educate students to what we call think critically, to think through situations, to be aware of values, of premises, of assumptions. And so seeing how Mrs. Bunting does that, I think, is of special interest for our participants. How does somebody reason her way through this situation?
You know, in your preparatory materials, you talked about the press as being virtually a character in the novel, in that it played such a prominent role in the progression of the story. And I wonder if these penny papers were more, and this is one of our group's questions actually, were of the salacious tabloid type, or were they actually where people got the substantial news of the day, or perhaps both? But what do you suppose would be important for us to know about the media as it was used in the film, in the book and the film?
I think probably the most important thing to know about the novel, and I'm glad that our participants brought that up, is that the penny press becomes a significant force in London in the time period of the Ripper, in the 1880s and 1890s. So it's cheaper, it's easier for people to get news. The penny press accepted advertising, so they were able to sell their copies for a penny each. People didn't have to, the reader didn't have to bear the full cost of those papers. And they were distributed by newsboys, so you could get them all over town. When I taught the Hitchcock class in London, we visited the City of London Museum, and there is a Jack the Ripper section there, and they have some of the newspapers of the time. And of course, the Ripper is the headlines. And in fact, one of the things they had in the paper was rotogravures, engraved images of some of the police artifacts or the police who were involved in it. So we want to know about the papers, that they were widespread, that this was really the era of the penny press. She was talking about something relatively new, in fact. So when she's looking at its infiltration in society, this was almost like social media for us today. It was relatively new. And it was a combination, to your point, it was a combination of tabloid and news. I would say heavier on the tabloid, and that's certainly a strong tradition in London newspapers, as we know. So it hyped the sensationalism. But it's important to recognize that it was a relatively new phenomenon. So she is partly exploring what it meant in people's lives.
The new phenomenon of the age might also have been the growing independence of women, and the way they're portrayed here. It seems like a fascination with the Ripper characters related to people's uneasiness, one of them said, with the growing power and independence of women, especially young women. And it seems that Hitchcock's adaptation really emphasizes this aspect by making innocent Daisy in the book into a little less so in the movie, once we've seen it, if we have. I just wondering what you think of why this seems to endure over time, and if that's not unrelated to it.
I think it endures because we remain fascinated by characters who experience moral dilemmas. If we think, for example, of, say, Crime and Punishment, or we think of other great works of literature, they often involve protagonists who come to grips with a difficult situation. And in any time period, even if we haven't experienced that exact situation, we're interested in how people come to a realization about the situation, how they work through the complexities that they're confronted with. The point about the women is interesting because Mrs. Belloc Lowndes is writing on the eve of World War I, and many people, as we know, have argued that the changes you see in women in the 1920s were partly a result of World War I. So Hitchcock's film is coming out in 1927. He directed it in 1926. So it's very much the era of the bright young things, of the flappers, of Isadora Duncan, of Josephine Baker, of women who dressed more casually, who went to work because so many men died during the war. So Hitchcock's working in a different time period, but he is also deliberately modernizing the character. And by modernizing her, you hit on it, that she makes her own decisions. She does not want anybody sheltering her in the country. She's not the kind of character in the film who's going to go to the country with her old aunt and take care of her. No way. She works in this dress shop and she likes dressing up, and that's how it is. And she's not going to trade that for a minute. So Hitchcock is modernizing the character, but he's also giving us somebody who is more independent, who makes up her own mind, who's not a victim. She's not just a vulnerable victim of the sleuth. She decides what she wants. So I would say the Buntings in the film are closer to the Buntings of the novel, whereas Daisy is absolutely a modern young flapper. And I think that makes her a more interesting character. It is consistent with the women in his films in the 1920s tend to be more independent. So in that sense, he's reflecting his time period. But I'll just say that independent women who think for themselves make interesting characters. so if you're looking for an interesting character in your story, that's one to go with. There's only so much Daisy can do in the novel. But an independent protagonist in the film can take you places that are intriguing.
Mm-hmm. Another interesting aspect that's been brought up by a number of the groups is the sort of social class that's represented in the film, and stereotypes that seem to be played out. But it's also interesting to ask, and one of the questions is, the Bunting's fear of losing the lodger's rent, which seems to drive her actions, would this in 1915 be an identifiable reality, the threat of starvation and pauper's prison for those who would have read the book at the time? And would this have been a common phenomenon, do you think?
Well, I think the kinds of class differences she talks about still exist. I mean, one of the things, I find that whole discussion, particularly at the beginning of the novel, very moving, because it talks about how the Buntings had this respectable life. They were in service. Mr. Bunting was able to take on additional jobs as a butler, and then gradually through scarlet fever, kind of mini epidemic, and through things that happened to their employers, their comfortable existence disappeared. It became threatened. And it spoke to me, I think, because there are people experiencing that now, that the things that you lived with and you took for granted and you thought were the foundation of your life are disappearing. And that's very disruptive. So I think in that sense, that section can speak to many people at different times. The other thing that I found very moving about that is that Mrs. Lowndes' description of their existence is very detailed. It talks about the furniture and things disappearing, and the impact of the cost of a penny for a newspaper, what a penny meant. And we understand that if you have to think of a penny, even a penny that was what it was worth at that time, that says something about the desperation. And then, of course, the fact that Mrs. Lowndes brings home very clearly that the Buntings were hungry. There was an article this weekend in the New York Times about food deprivation in the US. So this is something that speaks to us in any era, I think. They were hungry, and having that rent from the lodger meant they could eat. So when you realize the fundamental impact the lodger had on their physical existence, I really think that kind of situation might have resonated in the 1890s, in 1913, in the 1920s, certainly in the 1930s, but even today, very definitely.
Yeah, it was interesting that they had such a respect as a servant class for those whom they served. There was a real interesting dynamic played out there. And it did seem to sort of extrapolate further with their treatment of the lodger. He was a gentleman. And I think in some ways it may be the case that they were drawn to sort of cover for him, not only for their own, sort of pragmatic needs, but also because they appeared to have a respect for that respectable class, if you will.
I think that's an excellent point, and that is something that would change after World War One. So, and we saw this, for example, I suspect that some of our participants are fans of Downton Abbey, and that's something you see there as well, that the World War One changes the position of the aristocracy. Many of their children were killed. After the war, opportunities for people who had been in service open up, manufacturing and offices and so on. And so the mindset that you must protect the people you serve, or that the aristocracy deserves our respect, starts to shift after the war. But I think you're absolutely right that the novel embodies or dramatizes the view of protagonists who share this mindset that the people you serve are somehow better or deserving of respect, or should be protected. You definitely see it in Downton Abbey. I hadn't thought of that until you and our group pointed that out, but there's certainly that parallel as well.
We're coming to the end of our sort of back and forth, but I'm wondering, why do you think Hitchcock continues to be such an admired filmmaker even today? I mean, he's withstood time and memoriam and ends up being still one of the most revered filmmakers of all time. So what is it, do you suppose, that contributes to that?
I think that's a really interesting question. First of all, he had a 50-year career. There aren't many directors who started making films in the 1920s, and that was before synchronized sound. Film historians don't call them silent films because they usually had musical accompaniment. So we say films before synchronized sound. So he started before synchronized sound, and his last film was in the 1970s. So you think of that. Here is somebody who worked through sound, color, widescreen, shooting on location versus the studio, who worked in England, who worked in Germany, who worked in the US, who worked with any number of screenwriters, stars, composers, and was always creative. I mean, we have The Lodger, we have Sabotage, we have Rear Window, we have, which many of us saw in the pandemic book club. We have Vertigo, we have North by Northwest, we have Psycho. The same director made those films. So I think part of it is simply he was an amazingly creative person. Those films stand the test of time. But just the fact that someone could develop his approach to film over 50 years is amazing. It is interesting that it used to be, if you studied film studies, there would be a number of classes that focused on one director. So when I was in graduate school, I had classes on Orson Welles or Jean-Luc Godard or Jean Renoir. But now really the only person whose films we teach as a director class is Hitchcock. That's the one class in our curriculum that focuses on the films of one director. And it's partly, I think, the extent, the richness of his work. Also, there's been a phenomenal amount of critical writing. I have in my office, half my office bookcase is books on Hitchcock. There are that many. So his films have generated a lot of interesting discussion. But I really think it's the incredible length of his career and the variety of his creativity that has stood the test of time. We can think of any number of films that we like of his, and it's just amazing to think of how different they are.
Indeed, The Verge was traumatizing in my youth, and it remains with me for that reason. But yeah, he has an incredible portfolio of work. I'm going to leave it to you now, Susan, as we come to the end of our program, to give a little teaser for next time we gather and introduce the program for next week.
Yes, and I'm really excited to share this all with you. So next week, as you know, we'll talk about the film of The Lodger, and really, I think you will appreciate it even more, having read Mrs. Belloc Lowndes' novel. The film that you will see on YouTube or Amazon or the Criterion Channel is the version that was restored by the British Film Institute. And you can tell it's that version because the intertitles, the words that you see between the images, will be in color. They're in blue and orange. So that's the version you want. It was restored as part of a group of 9 early Hitchcock films that the British Film Institute restored. And it is our great pleasure next week to have the head of the conservation unit visit with us and talk to us about that restoration. I am really excited about this because they don't do this for anybody, but they're doing this for us. So it's really a perk for our book club. His name is Kieran Webb. I Zoomed with him this morning, and he's thrilled to be able to talk with everybody. So you will be getting an inside glimpse of what's involved in restoring the film that we're going to talk about. And he shared with me something I didn't know, which is that there is a connection between Hitchcock and the Olympics, which I have to say is not a connection we would automatically think of. So I'm just going to leave that as a little preview of something to stay tuned for next week, and that he will talk to us about. So we'll begin with that next week, and then go into our breakout rooms and then have our discussion later. But I think you'll really enjoy it. And he's going to talk about, one of the videos for next week talks about the work of a man named Ivor Montague in shortening the film. And he has worked with Montague's actual script material and will talk to us about that. So we really do have a special treat for next week, and I'm looking forward to sharing that with everybody. So I know you're going to enjoy seeing the film, and I know that we'll have a great time talking about it next week.
Thank you so much, Susan. It's been such a wonderful hour. I want to thank all of you for joining us. You don't get to see where you're all from, but you're all over the world. There's even one among us from Luxembourg, which is my family's native land. So I was delighted to see that. But you are from all over the world. We're so delighted that you've come together in this moment to be with Susan Ohmer and with Notre Dame. We invite you to continue the conversation on the discussion board we set up in the LinkedIn site that's associated with this program. In addition, for next week's meeting, please watch Hitchcock's film, The Lodger, as Susan has suggested, which is available free on YouTube at the link we've shared, and also on Amazon Prime and the Criterion channel. In addition, part 2 is now on ThinkND with short explainer videos. You may see the ones prepared for this week. There'll be those for next week by Susan. And then please review and come prepared to discuss the things we'll see this next week when we come together. Also, please feel free to share this series with your friends. We are accepting registrations throughout the entire 4 weeks of the program, as each meeting can stand alone. We welcome anyone to join us in any way that they can, whenever they can. And I'd like to conclude by thanking all those who've made this possible. Again, our sponsors, our good friends at the university and beyond, and the London Global Gateway, who's worked very hard to bring this together. And I don't take credit myself too much, other than to say we have a remarkable team there, and we're really grateful for their efforts, and to the Notre Dame Alumni Association. So thank you one and all, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.
Thank you so much.